Hey friends, welcome to our midweek moment. Pastor Nicole here. So glad you joined in. Well, this week we continued on in our sermon series, The Call, Answering God's Invitation. And we talked about the character Saul, who, if you follow his story, has this transformative experience where he becomes Paul, the apostle. And here's the thing about Saul. Saul grew up as a Pharisee. He was a Jew through and through. And so as he is going around, you know, arresting Christians, throwing them into jail, he truly believes that what he is doing is the right thing. He really, really believes that he is doing God's work, right? That he is answering God's call to stamp out Christianity and to get people back on the right track. Now, as we read through Saul's story, we find out that he has an encounter on his way to Damascus. He's on the road traveling, and he has this life-altering moment where, if there's a flash of light, he falls to the ground, he's blind, but he hears this voice saying, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul's like, "Who is this?" and the voice responds, "It's me, Jesus. Why are you doing this to me?" And so Jesus gets Saul's attention, right? And helps him to turn his life around, to stop persecuting Christians and instead start encouraging Christians. And as we know, Paul goes on to plant churches all over the ancient world. He is a mentor to young pastors in those congregations and an encourager in their faith and in the faith of those in the congregations. And I mean, he does a lot of incredible work to establish Christianity, something that we benefit from, thousands of years later. So here's the question, though. Saul was so sure before that moment on the Damascus Road that he was doing the right thing. And I wonder how many times we feel like we are doing the right thing, that we are doing what God has called us to do, but maybe we aren't actually doing what God has called us to do. We're doing something completely different. And so it kind of makes me wonder, how many times did Jesus try to get Saul's attention before he had to go major dramatic and flashlight blind him, bring him to his knees on the road? Were there other times that Jesus was like, "Hey, stop this. You're on the wrong path"? Were there other times that Jesus tried to intervene in Saul's life? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I often wonder if when we are going down a path that God doesn't want us on, if God is like constantly like, "Hey, listen to me. This is not what I want you to do. I want you to do this." I think sometimes as humans, we miss that call, right? We miss God's invitation to step off of the path that we are on and step onto a different path because we're just not listening. We're not paying attention. We're like so focused on whatever we are doing that we miss it. And sometimes God has to really get our attention. We kind of see that over and over in the stories that we've looked at. Moses had a burning bush that got his attention. Mary had an angel come and appear to her to tell her what she needed to do. I wish that those things kind of happened today, right? Then we could know for certain, like, okay, this is what God wants me to do. He sent an angel to tell me. Or this is what God wants me to do. I was left blind for 3 days. God's voice, everybody around me could hear it. That would be nice. But it just doesn't seem to work like that anymore. So how can we be sure that we are listening well, that we are following the path that God wants us on, that we are answering the call that God has placed on our life and not a call that we placed on our own life? I think it just takes a lot of prayer and listening, paying attention to voices around us. I think a lot of times God speaks through people around us to help us discern what we need to do and listen to where we need to go, because sometimes we have an idea of what we want to do and we're not going to get off of that path unless something happens, right? So let me tell a little story. we've been working on these letters for our members of Congress to ask them to make sure that they are thinking about those who need help with food. You know, women and children in our country, and men, and then people just around the world that need help through food assistance. And a couple of months ago, as we were planning this, a pastor friend of mine was like, you should really consider going to the Bread Summit in Washington, D.C. And I was like, I'm not going to the Bread Summit in Washington, D.C. I have other things to do. I have places to be. I just have a busy summer. I'm not going. Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it. And then it was another person's voice that invited me to go. And then it was another voice that said, hey, maybe you should consider. And I thought, okay, maybe God's trying to tell me something here. So if it was up to me, I would have just like stayed on my own path. I had my summer plans. I knew what was going on, but God spoke through others. And now I'm going to Washington, D.C. to help deliver those letters to our members of Congress and to make a plea with them that they would consider food stability for people who are in need. That's just one little example of how God can use others to help us listen better, focus better, to instead of focusing on what we want, to focus on what God wants. So as you're going about your week this week, pay attention to those little voices. Pay attention to the people that are speaking into your life. Pay attention to what you may be hearing during your prayer time, what that still small voice might be saying in the back of your mind. Pay attention to that. That is God calling us to do God's work in the world. So good luck listening for that voice of God and seeing if you are on the right path or if you need to veer off and go a different direction. And I hope you will join us this weekend as we continue this series. We are going to be talking about why is it important to build relationships when we think about God's call in our lives. So come back and listen in on that for whether in person or online. And have a wonderful rest of your week. Be listening.